Hi, everybody. My name is Ian O'Byrne. I'm the department editor of the Multiliteracies Department in the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. We're putting together a series of interviews with experts in the field to talk about some of the themes and concepts that we talk about in the columns. The latest column is on hybrid and blended learning. I wrote it with my colleague and friend, Christy Pytash. But basically, we're reaching out to experts to talk about the theme, talk about the issue, and figure out what do you really need to know as teachers and learners. So I'm really excited today to talk with a good friend of mine, Kathryn. You want to introduce yourself and tell us where you come from?
Sure. My name is Kathryn Kennedy. Thank you so much, Ian, for having me. And I am the Assistant Director for Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, which is a division, the research division of Michigan Virtual University. And we are a legislative directed entity that works on a lot of different research projects for K-12 online and blended learning. And each year we get about 14 legislative directives from the state of Michigan, and we're charged with doing research projects to help inform legislative directives and policies moving forward. And I have a amazing team of 5 people that I work with, and life couldn't be better.
Very cool. Yeah, there's a ton of webinars and resources, and what I love about the work that your group does is there's a lot of research and thought and theory and writing that goes behind it, but then there's also webinars that go along with it. Once you get into it, there's a pretty comprehensive package that you provide for educators, researchers, people to think about what these things mean.
Yeah, and the great part too is that we like to help go back and form practice as well. So it's very much on a practical level, and you can check it out at mvlri.org.
Yeah, most definitely. Check out the webinars, the old webinars that are out there. So the column was on hybrid and blended learning. It's one of those issues that, when we start off the school year, people say, well, this is a blended learning class, or this is hybrid learning. And then you have a lot of people that have blank stares and try to figure out, we go online and Google it and try to figure out what hybrid or blended learning means. And then we get even more confused. So you live this every day. What does hybrid or blended learning mean to you?
So hopefully, like I told you before, hopefully we don't leave with more questions than answers after I'm done with this. But really, I do live this every day. And one of the things that I start off by saying is that we come to it a lot of times from the mode of delivery rather than from the instructional strategies that are used within these different types of learning styles. So like you think about hybrid and blended learning, a lot of people go at it from the place of, okay, you can do a little bit of online learning and then you have a little bit of face-to-face learning. But a lot of times the definition stops there. And I think that's where we get into trouble, especially with new people coming into the field and not really understanding what it is. I think we need to go a step further, and a lot of people have gotten to that point, but a lot of times it's those people who are early adopters that are already to that point, and we have to kind of help out newbies to the area to get them past just the delivery mode. And so where I see and hope that it would be going is talking more at the instructional strategies level and what is going to be done online, what is going to be done in the face-to-face, because that's one of the biggest questions when I talk to practitioners. For example, I live in the state of Maine, telecommute to the state of Michigan for my job, and I had the opportunity and honor to teach some of the AP for All teachers about blended learning. And AP for All teachers are all online, but they're starting to do a kind of blended mode and trying to understand what that really means. And one of the really big questions that they had was, what do we do online and what do we choose to do in a face-to-face mode? So, and I think that's where we go back into what we've learned in terms of instructional strategies, what would make sense in the online environment, what would make sense in the face-to-face environment. And I'm kind of a Jonathan junkie, and so I go to that meaningful learning definition where you have, you know, the 5 aspects of that. You know, is it intentional? Are you being goal-directed with your students? Is it authentic? Are you developing these complex problem-solving, contextual, real-world situations for your students to figure out in these different spaces? And again, we don't really even have to talk about it in different spaces. It just has to have these components of meaningful learning. Is it constructive, or are students able to be self-reflective, articulative in their delivery of whatever representation of knowledge that they're providing you as an assessment? Is it cooperative? Are they working together? You know, we always talk about these types of 21st century learning skills where, you know, once they get out, they're going to have to be in these more collaborative and conversational spaces. But again, with our traditional mindset where, you know, everybody's in their desk and everybody's got to have their phones turned off and everybody is not talking to one another. So just setting up that space that is really transformational and can be transferred once they leave the learning situation. And then of course, active. I mean, you know, that's one of the biggest things for me is a lot of times I hear people say, well, you know, when they go home, they're going to watch this video and then they come in the class the next day and we're going to have a discussion, or they have the discussion online and then when they come to class, they're going to be doing worksheets. And then that's me cringing in the corner thinking, no, this is not blended learning. So I do think that we need a blended learning definition for now. But I think eventually it will become just good teaching. And this is something that we wrestled with. I worked with the International Association for K-12 Online Learning on their committee for developing the blended teaching competencies framework. And that's available online at inacall.org. And when I was working on that, we had about 90 people on the committee, and everybody's looking at, do we need to be very, very definitive, very, very narrow in our definition, or do we go broader? And that was one of the big questions. Do we kind of pigeonhole people into one space and say, this is what blended learning is, this is what blended learning isn't, or this is what blended teachers should be, this is what blended teachers shouldn't be? And we decided to be more general because, as you know, the field is changing on a regular basis. And so that fluidity, that water-like nature of the definition, I think has to be there. And I see that more and more now as an associate editor for the Journal of Online Learning Research. My colleague, Leanna Archambault at Arizona State University, and I co-edit that journal, and we have about 10 to 20 articles that come in to be considered for publication every week. And some of them are blended learning, about blended learning research. And we see the various definitions that people approach in there. And that's the most important point to it, is that, you have to define what you mean by blended learning. So we're looking at the contextual pieces, and each person has a very different way of defining it. And so in a way, that fluidity is really important, because as the field is changing, I think we have to be more mindful of seeing, is this what blended learning might be tomorrow? It might not be that way today, or at least in our context, it might not be that way, but maybe tomorrow it might be a little bit different. So I think that flexibility is really important. But the main thing is that we go beyond just the definition of the mode of delivery, and go more towards that instructional strategies level and what's happening in the classroom. And a good example of this would be Nicola Ware and her team just published an article in the Journal of Online Learning Research, the second issue, and it really gets down to that instructional strategies level. And our team here within the MyBlend program, it's myblend.org, they are starting to look at the teacher level and defining kind of like a profile of that teacher and what kind of strategies that they have in each of the modes of delivery, and saying, okay, this is what I do here. And also making it content specific. It's really important because, as you know, each content area might have different strategies that work best for that particular content. And when people get to that practical level, a lot of times we're just talking about the theory and the definition part, but when you get into that practical classroom space, what am I supposed to do? And what has worked before and what's not working, and having that those types of profiles or examples to go by, I think are really important for practitioners who are just starting out in the space.
Well, it's such a challenge to, I think those of us that teach in these hybrid spaces, or we deal with these new technologies, we're early adopters, or we're on the bleeding edge, or whatever we call it. It's that fluidity. It's Doug Belshaw called it. You have to have a certain sense of ambiguity. We like to really understand something, especially in education, especially in North America. We like to understand something, put a definition on it. We have the taxonomy of what that definition means. Colleagues of mine from Australia and around the world, they're like, why do you Americans love to define everything? But they basically say, Doug says you have to have a certain ambiguity. And I call it wiggle room. Like you look at a definition, or you look at hybrid or blended learning, and you can't really say this is exactly what it is, because it's, my advisor, Don Liu, basically talked about literature as deixis, that things are constantly in a state of change. And so these definitions and our understandings will continue to change along the process. And one of the follow-up questions I was going to ask, and you started to hint at it, was, what does good, hybrid or blended learning look like? Do you have like a case study or an example? And all these links I'll grab from you and we'll put in the post, but is there an example of what good hybrid learning, or a model or something, hypothetically, for an instructor that I might know that might have kids watch a video and discuss a little bit and come into class? Maybe that's not the best use of time. What would a great use of time be in a hybrid model?
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep in mind that idea of meaningful learning. So whenever developing a lesson, to keep those things in mind and actually think about it. Okay, is it goal directed? Well, hopefully, yes, it is, because you have standards, at least in the K-12 area, that you have to go by. But like, is it authentic? Are they really thinking about these bigger questions? Are they thinking about the link to how it is in the real world and what it means for them to be dealing with this particular problem in their life? And is it constructive? Are they reflecting on their learning as they're going through it? Is it cooperative? Are they able to work with other people? A lot of times you see people working in these silo effects, and that's definitely not how look at this, look at what we're doing right now. Like, this is not how we work when we get out into the real world, for the most part. And then, is it active? Are they just being passive and just learning from the technology, or are they learning with the technology and using it as a way to kind of interact with others, interact with the content online, or and in a face-to-face mode? I would hope that it would be more active learning. You have these different models that they use, the station rotation and all of these types of things. And I've seen it happen in different ways, but a lot of times what I see is students kind of developing their own path of learning. And then, especially linked to their interests and everything. For example, I went down to South Carolina and saw some of the schools that are in the Horry County public schools, and they're doing this huge blended learning initiative. And what I saw is the woman who was the teacher in like the health area. And so these students are coming in and they're learning on these dummies. They might do some kind of preparatory and discussion type of things online before they come into the classroom, and then in the classroom they're actively using the dummies to practice CPR and to dislodge something from like the baby's throat that happens to be stuck. And you know, it's like these very much real world, this is what you're going to be doing once you get out there. And then I've also seen blended learning happening in Rhode Island with the Fuse RI program that's run by the Highlander Institute. And they are starting off at the ground level, you know, working with each of the districts and trying to do like a full-on blended learning implementation throughout. And they have these nice little pilots within each of the schools so that the teachers within those schools can see what does blended learning look like in practice. And I think these are like the very practical side of things. And so within a content area, say math, you know, you have students who are kind of working in these stations around a graphing calculator, and everybody's kind of contributing to the problem solving. But the problem itself is very authentic. It has to do with something that is like a real world problem that they have to work together to solve. And so it's, to me, that idea of meaningful learning is where that, you know, that new person should start in kind of planning out a lesson that they want to change from a traditional standpoint, the way that they used to do it, to a more active and where it's meaningful learning rather than just rote learning. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Well, it's hard because you know, and I've said this before, I said on, you know, your webinar, you know, that the challenge is that this is not how, you know, the quote unquote normal people interact. Most people aren't video conferencing and tuning in. And, you know, I regularly, you know, will get a video conference from a friend or a colleague or a student. And I'm like, hey, video conference, you know, call me up on my phone. Like, let's get in touch and interact, and let's write on a Google Doc. And most people are like, how do you do that? So the one of the questions is, you know, why do this? Like, what opportunities does this provide, you know, for K-12 or for a higher ed environment? Like, what are the benefits? What are the opportunities for this in K-12 and higher ed? And is there a difference? Is there a difference between what you can do and benefits in higher ed as opposed to K-12?
Yeah, I do think there are definitely opportunities for this. And, you know, I go back to that idea of being, you know, having those 21st century skills. And those sometimes are very kind of murky, but essentially it's that idea of knowing that you need to work with people in this type of an environment when you get out of school. So why not start it early on so that you kind of help students develop those skills ahead of time? And I think blended learning offers those opportunities by way of intentionally setting up students. And again, you're looking at standards that are separate from the standards on top of, you know, that they have to do already. But I think it's really essential to do that because you're giving that student that one extra level of life skills that they'll need when they get out. And I think in terms of the differences that I've seen so far between K-12 and higher ed implementation, we were talking a little bit before we went live about this. One of my colleagues that I'm familiar with at Florida State University, and her name's Vanessa Denon, and I just did a panel with her at the Blended Learning Conference within OLC, or what was formerly Sloan C. And one of the interesting things that we were talking about these exact questions is like, what is blended learning? And so what she kind of did was kind of put it on its head and said, you know, why do we really need to define this? And why isn't it just, and you said this, why isn't it just good teaching is good teaching is good teaching, and bad teaching is bad teaching is bad teaching? Why do we have to have a definition of this? And so from the K-12 standpoint, I mean, I feel like we're farther into this than a lot of higher ed is. And I feel like from what Vanessa said is that higher ed still sees it as really technology integration, and it also sees it as more of that delivery mode and just centering on that as a delivery mode. So I'm doing some of this online and I'm doing some of this face-to-face. And a lot of the online is just very static things. So like a PowerPoint, watch this PowerPoint of me lecturing, and then they come to the classroom and they're looking at the PowerPoint again, and the professor is lecturing that, and she sees that all the time, and it being labeled blended learning. And in K-12, you have the same kind of thing happening too, but I think more and more, and again, here we go into the definition piece, it's like, how particular are we going to be about guiding people down a path? And I think we have to go to the meaningful learning place again, and making sure that these are the types of things that help to guide a teacher as he or she is putting together a lesson, and making sure that the benefits of that are that the student is goal directed so that they can transfer that knowledge to their day-to-day life, making sure it's authentic so that it is transferable to the daily life, instead of just, well, this is what I learned in school today, but it has nothing to do with what I do on a regular basis, that real disconnect that often happens. And I can name like a million things that I did in K-12 that I'm just like, what was that about? Why did I even do that? What's the purpose? And unfortunately, a lot of my memories are of those things, and I'm thinking to myself, it's not useful to me right now. I'm not applying it. All I can do is remember it. It's just taking up space. Constructive wise, it's just, making sure that people are reflective within their learning. I think that idea of providing students that opportunity to reflect is really important, and a really important skill to be able to transfer out. And cooperative, again, we're going to be working with people all the time. And you see it day in and day out in organizations where people just, don't have that skill. And it's like, this is a really important skill to be able to have, and being active and observant and understanding the context around you. And so I really do, I feel like the way that it's set up is really, really important. And I think that if we just concentrate on the delivery mode, we really do a disservice. I think it's more about the meaningful learning that you're trying to, or that learning environment that you're trying to create, and making sure that it's intentional in that, students are going to be able to get something out of it that they can apply at a later time somewhere else. Transference is really important.
I love the fact that you went back to the definition and talked about the fluidity that you need, because a lot of times, I think about higher ed, and a lot of times in higher ed, at your local institution, they will say, well, we need blended or hybrid learning. We know that it's important. We heard it at some college conference that we need this, so we need it also. Mm-hmm. And then we have studies and surveys that ask instructors, well, how do you use blended learning? And they say, well, I use Blackboard. Like, I've got Blackboard. We have to use Blackboard. So I have blended or hybrid learning. I have Blackboard. And then the discussion stops there. And then researchers and scholars are chastised by other organizations saying, hey, this is the only way that they're using blended or hybrid learning or technology is through Blackboard. Right. And so the problem is, like, yes, we need to define, but also I think if you define it and you try and crystallize it enough so that we can say this is exactly what we want to see, then you're going to see 100 versions of the same thing. Yeah. It's just like you're teaching middle school all over again. You're going to see exactly what you want your students to do. So what challenges are out there? So, I mean, as we talk about this new frontier and all this fluidity, and there's multiple ways to express yourself, and we're making up as we go along, what are some of the challenges as we start to incorporate blended learning, hybrid learning into our classroom?
Well, I think it builds on what you were just saying in regard to, higher ed, where they see some other university or organization adopting something, and they automatically, it's almost like a keeping up with the Joneses effect, and the same thing happens in K-12, where like a you know, and a district says, oh, well, if they have it, we're going to have it. And then they buy the technology and then it ends up just sitting there. Or, you know, you don't have that, sustainable professional development that is necessary to make this implementation mean something. You know, I see it at Fuse RI in Rhode Island. They have really thought out what they need to do in order to have that sustainable professional development for every single stakeholder involved in that blended learning implementation. And I feel like the challenges of adopting something, but then not having that plan in place to really meaningfully implement it in a sustainable way and really giving stakeholders what they need in order to make it an effective implementation is I mean, I see it happen all of the time, and it's so heartbreaking because people dump a lot of money into initiatives and then they just like they tank, and it's horrible. And you see like all of this technology not being used. You know, I remember when my sister's school had gotten a smart board, or what was it? A Promethean board. And she said, you know, we had one of the technicians come in and show us how to turn it on. And I said, and that's it. And I was like, no. Like, you have to do it at the content level. You have to do it at the, you know, that, you know, wherever they are K-12 wise, you know, developmentally, what works for students. And, you know, just turning on the technology is not going to be very much, you know, that's not all they need. And they need something that's consistent and sustainable. Like I said, just, you know, that constant professional development and really guidance on lesson. I mean, just at the lesson level, like, how do you change this to be blended? How do you change this to be put into an online mode? And it doesn't make sense to be in an online mode. Does this particular part of the lesson make more sense to be in a face-to-face mode? And you really just have to kind of really delve into those instructional strategies. Like, what makes sense to where the students are going to get the most out of this content by way of where we have it going through? Like, does it make more sense in the online? Does it make more sense in the face-to-face? And that's where you use the delivery modes. That's where the question comes in, as delivery modes, whereas a lot of times we have the delivery modes up here, and this is what we say, oh yeah, well, I do some of this online, some of this in blended. No, like, how do you do that? It's the how more so than the what, or the ways in which they're delivered. So I think that's where the challenges come in, is that, you know, people just do not have enough guidance in that implementation process. And a lot of times these initiatives tank because the thought process initially is not thought out enough. And like I said, Fuse RI has a really great program that they have implemented, that they've thought about it all the way from the beginning to the end, where they kind of say, okay, well, where is this district in regard to a bunch of different categories of what they need? Like, what kind of infrastructure do they have already? What kind of technologies? What kind of assessments do they have? And looking at the different things and what makes sense, you know, moving forward. How much more information, what kind of information do they need to know about blended learning in order to understand, okay, is this really robust enough in order to move forward? And if it's not, what do we need to do to make this robust enough in order to move forward with the implementation? And, you know, and like I said, the sustainability part of the professional development is probably the most important piece when looking at blended learning initiatives. A lot of these people that our MyBlend program work with, they work at the teacher level a lot of times, and they have coaches. We have coaches here that work directly with the teachers. And what I think is really important about that is that they are working one-on-one with them at that lesson level, and getting them past just the mode piece and getting them more to that question of, well, what makes sense to be in the online? What makes sense to be in the face-to-face? Like, what is most effective for the students' learning? in terms of what the content is, and how it's going to be learned in a meaningful way. And so I think that level of guidance is what's necessary, and a lot of times it's not what's provided. And then we get into the questions of, do we have enough funding for that? And a lot of times the answer is no. And so that slippery slope of keeping up with the Joneses for both K-12 and higher ed is really, 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 really scary, because a lot of folks will just jump in and they won't have the thought to continue the learning beyond just the one-stop or one-time shot of professional development on how to, like, what the theory is, what the definition is. Okay, beyond that, I need some guidance at my instructional level, and a lot of times that's not given. So I feel like that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I see.
Oh yeah, you pretty much need hybrid or blended learning program to help educators figure out blended learning. It's coming in with Greg McVeary. We helped Boston Public Schools roll out iPads. We had different initiatives where we would bring technology into instruction, and it would be, okay, we're going to bring you all together. We're going to have a workshop, or a 2-day workshop, or a couple days, and then we're going to let you go in the wild. And you're going to get out there and you're going to have questions, because those questions that you just asked about, what makes the most sense? What's the best tool to use for this, or how do I use the tool, or, what makes more sense in online as opposed to face-to-face, or vice versa. Those are things that, for the most part, we figure out through trial and error. And, and you need someone to help talk you through it, or prompt you with that, and let you know that you should be asking those questions. And
right.
So it's almost like, let the instructors go out, let teachers go out, try these things, try instructionally, crash and burn a couple times, and then come back and have the wherewithal and the fortitude to come back and say, it's okay, I'm still learning. Have the flexibility in their school, and through their teacher evaluation system, to not get blown up. And same thing in higher ed. It's your evaluations many times are more important in some institutions than your pubs and research and everything else. So if you're playing around with these models and testing it out in your classroom, you might be penalized for trying to do so. So then it's bigger questions about, what are our goals and what's the focus? So trying to identify those questions about, like, what makes the most sense and what's the best use of, instructional or pedagogical tools. There's a lot of guidance out there. A lot is from your organization. Once again, we said at the very beginning to go out and look at the webinars, look at the resources, get involved, get in contact with you, and the hybrid, the blended learning community is very approachable online. There's a lot of, if you reach out, people are there to help you. So what's your advice for educators that are looking at this and saying, okay, great, I want to do it, or yes, I'm that instructor that has a PowerPoint online, or my answer is I use Blackboard. How do you get started?
Yeah, I think there's so many different resources to go to. I know the Christensen Institute has a great deal of information on blended learning. INACOL as well, the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, has a lot of information. One of the things that INACOL just did is a blended learning implementation roadmap, and that is available, and that looks at the iLearn or iZone NYC or iLearn NYC New York City schools that were kind of like the test bed of blended learning in that area. And they do a really, really good job about showing the various spectrum of blended learning implementation at the school level, but then look at the various teachers that had been involved in it, and seeing, like, what kind of things are working, what's not working. And I think that's where people need to kind of jump in and see these types of profiles, like what our My Blend program has done, where they interview teachers and they say, you know, what's working, what's not working, what's changed since you've gone from, you know, your traditional way of teaching to this more blended learning style of teaching. And I think learning from people in that way, just on a general level, is really important. And then you get into, you know, trusting your own intuition in terms of instructional strategies that you already know. And like I said, I'm a Jonathan junkie, and kind of using those 5 pieces, 5 components is really important to do. And just taking that lesson and saying, and trust your intuition. Like, do you think that this would work well in an online environment? If so, is it active? And kind of go through the checklist. Is it active learning? Is it cooperative learning? And what kind of things do I need to incorporate that are not there right now that would make it more blended by way of doing that? And I think that's the biggest thing, is kind of just starting and trusting yourself, because a lot of times, you know, you go into it thinking it needs to be the best it can. I can't fail in front of my students. And that's one of the things when I did some interviews with the Fuse RI teachers and the fellows who are assigned to different districts to help their implementation process, is this one woman, Deb Ram. She said, you know what? She's like, you have to be able to know that you're going to fail and you're going to have to tell your students, I'm trying something new. This might fail. And if it does, I'll start over and we'll do something different. But that, even in and of itself, is a life lesson that I think is really important for your students to figure out too. And a lot of times even when they get to college, they're in that mindset of everything has to be perfect. I can't fail. And I think that's a good life lesson, no matter where they are in the education setting. You know, that's a huge life lesson to learn, is that vulnerability standpoint of, you know, it's going to happen. It's okay not to be perfect all the time. God knows I'm not. And so it's a matter of you know, being transparent for your students and saying, you know, I'm trying this out. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but it's something new. And, you know, this is what my intentionality is in it. And this is what I hope that we get out of it. And then have the students help reflect on it and say, well, you know, I don't know if I like this part too much, and then each time that lesson is implemented and each time the subsequent lesson is implemented, they can always go back and say, well, I learned this from that. So moving forward, I'm going to do this differently. And just showing students that this is your thought process is going to be a life lesson for them as well. And even structuring their own learning by way of doing that type of setup is going to be, I think, change of education, honestly.
Well, that's the, you know, I mean, I had the benefit of working in education. And so one of the things I want my students to come out, you know, if they left with one thing and one thing only, it would be that they are healthy, reflective practitioners, that they can come out and first recognize that something didn't work, and then try and problematize and try and, you know, develop some sort of solution, and how are they going to address the problem, and then go back and try again. You know, and hopefully try something different that might work. And if they can leave with that. And so a lot of times in my classes, I will openly reflect, you know, and, you know, my intent is that I want them to sort of, you know, see what I'm doing and hear what I'm thinking and get that feedback. But a lot of times, you know, students will come in and they'll say, well, that's not how we do school. Like, you're the expert. I'm the one that sits here and listens. You're supposed to tell me. And so if you openly say, well, maybe that didn't really work that well, they're like, well, you're not really qualified to be here, are you? And it's like, well, you know, and so you tell them the whole story, but even still, they'll come in and say, well, things didn't work out. You should have planned ahead for that. I'm like, well, if you haven't paid attention, like, we're way bleeding edge here, you know, like literally things are coming out of this class. Things are coming out of your mouth. I'm writing it up in research reports and I'm presenting it. Like, that's the process here. That's what we're doing right now. You know, that's the way that this operates. So, but once again, I want to thank you for your time. I learned a lot. I know that, this added a great deal of complexity to the original column. I think that you give us a much more informed perspective on what Christy and I try to present. So where can people find you? I have to get back in touch with you to get all of the links and all of the info and all the connections. But, if people want to get in touch with you, your organization, find out some of the work, where do you hang out on the internets?
Yeah, sure. I'm at Kennedy78 on Twitter. Our organization is mvlri.org, Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. And like you said, we have webinars once a month, and we also have a collaborative where people can come in and join our research community and learn about opportunities to start researching in this field, because we need a lot more people to help to answer the questions of what's working, what's not working in K-12 online and blended learning especially.
Very cool. I hope all the other 77 K Kennedys have done as much as you have with that email address. So once again, we're conducting a series of interviews to reach out to experts in the field to talk about the issues we bring up in the columns. We invite you to respond. Read the column. It's out there. The pre-publication draft is out there. We'll have a series of interviews. We put them all together. Please read, respond, comment, have your own video blog responses. Let us know what you think, what you feel. Get in touch with Kathryn. Get in touch with Michigan Virtual Learning. There are a lot of opportunities out there if you're trying to play in this space and figure out what it means and figure out some of that, that flexibility within the model. We need your help. So that being said, we'll say good night.